Thank you for joining us, Mr. Pauken. Let's get the easy question out of the way. Why are you running for governor?
Well, I think our state faces a number of serious issues, and it's about time we had common sense solutions to address those issues from a conservative standpoint. We've got a lot of good things going for us in Texas. We're the #1 place in America to do business. We have a terrific policy, if you will, of encouraging private sector job growth, which has taken place as a result of a strong energy base, a good tax and regulatory system. But at the same time, we've got an educational system that's designed to push everybody to go to a 4-year university. And when the governor asked me to come back in and chair the Texas Workforce Commission, and I'd been in the private sector since leaving the Reagan administration, but in 2008 I came into Austin and saw an educational system which had neglected, almost denigrated vocational education. And meanwhile, we have a shortage of skilled workers. Average age of a plumber is 56, of a welder 55, of a stonemasonry craftsman 69 years of age. Graying workforce and the neglect at the high school and post-secondary level of the value of vocational and technical education. So I set about to change it. And finally, this legislative session with House Bill 5, which was authored by Representative Jimmy Don Aycock, we're seeing a recognition that kids learn differently. One size doesn't fit all. Not everybody is designated or should be pushed into going to a 4-year university, and a recognition that there ought to be multiple pathways to a high school education. A math and science emphasis for those who want to go into college, a humanities and fine arts emphasis for college preparatory students, and a career and technical education initiative for those who want to go into a career and get an industry certified credential by the time they graduate from high school, or a license, so that they can go out and earn a good living and go on to college if they want to, or just go to work. And we need to get back to local control of education, and, if you will, a recognition that not everybody is necessarily suited to go to a university.
So do you feel that on the state level it's been a failure of policy or failure of leadership?
I think it's a combination, failure of policy and failure of leadership. I think one of the things that happens is people can stay too long. I've seen it in Washington, D.C. I worked for President Reagan, who really never forgot where he came from. And it wasn't just that he was a great communicator. We came up with common sense solutions based on our conservative principles to address the problems facing our nation at the time. And if the Republicans and the conservatives want to stay in power, then we've got to do that here in Texas. Rhetoric is cheap. But I'm a little tired and frustrated with the sound bites, the preaching to the choir, the sort of the bullet points, or the easy things to appeal to our base. We've got to do what we did in the Reagan administration. And what is authentic conservatism is, look, let's solve problems that are the concern of a majority of Texans. And education is right there. Robin Hood, for example, which is an unfair taxing system, which results in $1.1 billion transferred from some districts to others. Double taxation for people living in 374 school districts around the state. A lousy way to finance public education. I led the fight against it when Ann Richards tried to put it in with a constitutional amendment. We defeated it, but she put it in legislatively, and it's still there. Almost 20 years later, it is in place. It needs to go. We need to have a fair and more equitable system of funding public education. And I just think at times I see state government on autopilot. It's kind of don't make waves, but not a willingness to address the tough issues.
Well, what alternatives do you have that you favor over Robin Hood?
Okay, with regard to Robin Hood, you're talking about two aspects. One is the original system was local property taxes stayed in the local area. With Robin Hood, as it's called, the Robin Hood School Finance Scheme, you took from certain districts that are so-called property-rich districts and passed it to so-called property-poor districts, with the state as the redistribution agent. The irony is that now what started out as about 40 districts has turned into 374 districts. And let's take an example with the Eagleford Shale, which has been a very successful energy project. All of a sudden, districts which formerly were property poor are now property rich. So you've got 374 districts that fall under this. And so $1.1 billion is transferred in property taxes from some districts to others with the state as a redistribution agent. I would prefer getting rid of that, eliminating that $1.1 billion, keeping the local property taxes in the local areas, and replacing that $1.1 billion with either an expanded sales tax or a slightly higher sales tax. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is school finance is so complicated. We're always in the courts. One district can get more than another district that's very comparable in state funding because of the complications and confusion with regard to school financing. Now, there are very few people who even understand it, and I think the time has come to really have a fairer and more equitable system of school funding and get us out of the courts once and for all. We've been able to put together a coalition to, if you will, move education policy in a direction of multiple pathways. I think we can put a coalition together of interested parties, business leaders, property owners, educators, and come up with a fairer and more equitable system of funding education. But my point is, you can't just kick the can down the road and ignore these problems which have been out there for an extended period of time.
And by local control, do you also mean moving local control of curriculum?
Yes, I would say you have basic foundation courses. In other words, everybody would take certain basic foundational courses. But my preference would be to get away from this 15 end of year exams. They're talking about moving it to 5, and go back to a system in which testing, at least on the state level, is for diagnostic purposes. When I went to school, not many moons ago, but when I went to school at the grade school level, we had what was called the Iowa or Stanford standardized test. And young people would be given the test, and the teacher, the principal, the superintendents could see where the kids were and what progress is being made, where they were weak, where they were strong, but it wasn't the end all and be all. And it wasn't a substitute for testing on content learning grade by grade. And I think if we could go back to a system at the grade school level where we use testing as a diagnostic tool, at the high school level for those students moving towards college, test them using the ACT or SAT, which are the measurements that colleges themselves use. And for those students who want to go into career and technical education, measure them by how they're doing in terms of moving towards getting an industry certified credential or a license by the time they graduate from high school. So you would have different performance measurements, but much more local control, basic foundational courses. But when I was in the Reagan administration, we were trying to get rid of the power of the Federal Department of Education and move power back to the states and the local communities. It makes no sense for a Republican administration to be pushing for more state and federal control of education, and yet that's what's been happening.
You mentioned sound bites earlier,
right,
and you used the word conservative. And conservative seems to be a really popular word among Republicans. Sure. What's your definition of conservative, and how is it different than Rick Perry's or General Abbott's?
Well, I know Rick, I know Greg, like them personally, but I think they're often reading from a script. We're preaching to the choir. Authentic conservatism, I was part of the Goldwater-Reagan movement, is really a reflection of the idea that we need to come up with common sense solutions to the problems we face based upon our conservative principles. That to me is authentic conservatism. How you bring people together, and you bring them together around sound ideas. We've got too much of preaching to the choir, 40% versus 40% approach. We're never going to, take back our country nationally and get the left back on the defensive if we're always reacting to the left. I mean, it's great to be against Obamacare and be for the Second Amendment. I don't know many Republicans that are for Obamacare and against the Second Amendment. I mean, I'm a strong proponent of the Second Amendment, strong proponent of a consumer-driven healthcare system that has a safety net for people. But the reality is, if we're against something, for example, at the national level or even at the state level, what are we going to do as conservatives to come up with a better solution? And I think there's too little of that. In the Reagan administration, the man I worked for, Ronald Reagan, he was a good communicator, but he was about solving problems. I mean, when We came in 1981, the president said, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. We've got to encourage private sector job creation. And we put policies in place with the Kemp-Roth Job Creation Act to do that. We put in place a program called the Grace Commission to look for savings and efficiencies in the federal government. We need something comparable like that here in Texas, a blue ribbon commission of outsiders to come in and look at state government and determine what are our essential services and what are our non-essential services. For example, the governor and attorney general are on this cancer board, if you will. Why are we spending $3 billion in debt here in Texas for cancer? A particular cancer picking winners and losers in terms of who gets the money when we've got serious water and transportation problems here in Texas. I know cancer is a significant problem, but so is Alzheimer's, so is heart disease. Once you start down that road, where do you stop? It's really almost a form of crony capitalism where you're picking winners and losers, and you've got a lot of Austin insiders and a lot of people who make big contributions that are trying to influence government. And I think we need a more independent direction down in Austin.
Well, if you believe that crony capitalism exists, you mentioned, you know, cancer.
Right.
What other areas of government, especially on the state level, do you think it's the most prevalent, and how will you stop it?
How would I change it? Okay, number one, I would agree with Senator Eltife to just defund that $3 billion fund and instead redirect the resources into transportation or water where we need them. Secondly, I was in the private venture capital business after leaving the Reagan administration. I know how hard it is to make money in the private sector. What is the public sector doing, getting involved with an emerging technology fund, which is picking winners and losers and making investments in companies? Often those investments are made with the advice of people who are politicians, not people with money, their own money at risk. And I think that's something that would go immediately if I were elected governor. I also believe in term limits. I, again, agree with Senator Eltife and his proposed constitutional amendments. I think 2 terms, which would be 8 years for statewide elected officials, is sufficient. I've long been a proponent of term limits, and I believe we need to get that passed. It's passed the Senate, and hopefully will pass the House, because I think you get an inbred mentality if you've been there too long. I've seen it. I've seen it in Washington, and I've seen it in Austin the last few years as well.
Well, you know, with crony capitalism, it's often considered, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Sure.
You know, you get subsidies, I get donations. How can you compete with that on a campaign when millions of dollars are being poured into other campaigns, and you're saying, I don't want that kind of money, I don't want any strings attached? How do you compete with that?
Well, I think you got to take the case to the public. I think you've got to build a grassroots organization. I remember when I ran for state party chairman in 1994, the Republicans were in the minority in this state, and I said we need to bring the social and economic conservatives back together, build a party from the grassroots up. The party had become too much a top-down apparatus. I think our state government has become that way. I think we're very fractionalized as a party. I think you've got to build a grassroots movement across the state, be willing to talk frankly about some of these issues that other candidates want to duck, and at the same time put a coalition of people to bring the Republicans back together, because if the left and the Obama crowd continues to divide us, continues to force us to react, rather than us being proactive and putting them on the defensive, then we're going to continue to lose ground. And that's my fear, that 5 years from now we could wake up with a nasty surprise. So the key is, number one, can I raise enough money to make a credible campaign and a winning campaign? And in effect, you have enough chips to get into the game. And secondly, can you put a grassroots organization together that will, in a sense, build a new conservative team for Texas, a combination of the older Reagan conservatives who are still out there and a lot of the new young people who are coming into the legislature and are active at their local level and need to be involved as part of a team. See, I learned with Ronald Reagan, it was not about loyalty to politicians, it was about loyalty to principle. And I think we've got too many people, as Maggie Thatcher might say, that they want to be somebody rather than do something. And I want to be there as governor to do some things that I think need to be done in Texas and bring people together in our state.
The other 800-pound gorilla in the room is Medicaid, and it looks like Texas is going to reject Medicaid expansion. What do you think is the best way to reform Medicaid in Texas?
Well, two things. Number one, this is a good example of us not being proactive on two issues, really, Medicaid and the Voting Rights Act. I saw Greg Abbott the other day saying Section 5 Voting Act of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. Well, I happen to agree with him, but where were Rick and Greg back in 2005 when we had a Republican in the White House, a Republican-controlled Senate, and a Republican-controlled Congress? Why weren't our folks up there saying, don't extend the Voting Rights Act and put Texas under it while we ignore voting fraud in Chicago? And the same with regard to Medicaid. When George W. Bush was president, where was our leadership saying we want a waiver so that we can block grant Medicaid back to our state? Rhode Island got one with a Republican president, and Rhode Island was a Democratic state, and Texas didn't. So that's, you put yourself behind the 8 ball if you're always reacting as opposed to being proactive. Where we are now, I think realistically, you only take the money if in effect you can get it without the strings attached. And if you can do that, fine. If the strings are attached and you can't extricate yourself from them, or you cannot put legislation in place to get the money with no strings attached and challenge the Obama administration on 10th Amendment grounds, because really the Supreme Court case recently on Obamacare was silent on this issue as to what the federal government can do to states. I just think we've got to think this through very carefully and see if we can get the money without the strings attached, but don't take the strings if we can't get out from under it.
We don't know who you're going to be facing. We don't know if Perry or Abbott are going to run. Would you be willing to debate them in public, and do you think they would be willing to debate you in public?
Well, I hope so. I think we need to have a series of debates all across the state, public forums. I think as soon as they announce, we ought to have public forums across the state throughout the summer and into the fall. Let the people decide. Let us talk about issues. I tend to think that unfortunately some of our elected officials, they duck debates. They think they've got a lot of money so they can spend it on the 30-second sound bites and the commercials and going out and trying to, if you will, please the crowd or play to the crowd of our base. I think it's important to debate all of these issues, and I would hope they would agree to it. But I'm perfectly willing to engage in as many debates as people across the state are willing to put on. And I think that's important so that people can see who the people are who are running for governor. When I was a kid, I still remember as a young person getting interested in politics, and back then we just had one party, the Democratic Party, but you had the conservatives and you had the liberals. And I still remember watching Alan Shivers and Ralph Yarborough, and they debated from time to time, and it really helped me as a young person decide that I wanted to be with the conservatives.
If it's a two-man race, who would you rather face?
Oh, I can't pick. I mean, that's their choice. The reality is they both could be in the race. Rick Perry has said that if he runs, Greg Abbott's agreed not to run, or Rick could hand it off to Greg Abbott or attempt to have it hand it off. But I'm a little tired of the idea you just sort of pass it on and people are there forever and then they move up the ladder. So I don't care which one or if both are in the race. I can't control that. All I can do is lay out what I would do if elected governor of the state of Texas.
You know, you mentioned authentic conservatism. How are you authentic? What makes you unique that you can bring to the table that Governor Perry, General Abbott can't?
Well, I think authentic conservatism means solving problems based on your conservative principles, and I think being grounded in the philosophy rather than just spouting the rhetoric. And with all due respect, I've been in the movement since I started in the Goldwater for President campaign, I was national chairman of the College of Republicans, and before I enlisted in the Army and went on to Vietnam, I led the fight against the student radicals in the mid-60s. I've been tested time and time again, served in the Nixon administration, left when I became disenchanted in '71, turned down a position, was asked to come back into the Reagan administration, ran a federal agency that was probably the most liberal agency in the federal government. Used to be called OEO when Don Rumsfeld headed it. We turned it around. I cut the budget by 25%, cut the bureaucracy in half, did more with less, defunded the Alinsky Acorn groups, which had been funded under the Carter administration, then came home to Texas. I've got private sector experience, which neither Greg nor Rick have, and I think being in the small business sector, you understand the reality of the tough decisions that have to be made in the private sector to make a business succeed, having been in the venture capital business. And I think that I'm willing to take on those tough issues that so far both of them have avoided and bring together coalitions. We can't be just fighting among ourselves, and also we've got to reach out and attract Hispanics to our party again. I mean, I represented President Reagan in the White House in 1984 in the Rio Grande Valley when a left-wing group, an Alinsky affiliate, was trying to take over the politics of that area. I worked with local leaders, almost overwhelmingly Hispanic leaders down there, and Ronald Reagan carried the valley. The Hispanic community tends to be patriotic, pro-family, pro-life, and we've got to reach out and identify leaders who are with us in the Hispanic community and build coalitions. And we can do that. We've done it before. We can do it again. But I really think we're running a risk if we don't bring Texans together around good, solid issues. The example of educational reform, I've done it and worked with other groups without any support from the current leadership down there in Austin. And both Rick and Greg Abbott have defended our current school finance scheme as perfectly proper, and in my judgment, it is a violation of our statewide constitutional prohibition against a statewide property tax. And I fought it then, and I'll change it if elected governor.
So where can people go to learn more about your campaign?
They can go to tompaukenfortexas.com.
All right, well, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Hal. Thanks for having me.